Hey, I'm coming on today to share with you an experience I had when at the Weowaka Retreat Center in Lake George, New York last week. I was at a full day workshop about trauma, and one of the things we covered is using creative expression to tell our story. And one of our tasks was to tell our story using some form of art. And so some people chose to paint, some people chose to collage, some people chose to draw. We had lots of options. And I chose to tell my story in little boards using collage. So I'd like to share with you my story in the way I'm telling it using creative expression, because it is actually pretty profound for me. And I'm hoping that maybe by sharing my story in this way, it'll give you ideas of how you can use creative expression to also tell your story. So I'll share with you. So my first board, well, I'll just put them down. So I'll do one at a time. So I don't know if you can see this, but my first board has spiders on it. And I know it's not showing up great in the camera right now and with the light shining on it, but there's three spiders and you're also seeing the web. Now, this part of my story represents when I was a child and in my early teens, when I was violated numerous times by different men. And the spiders represent the men crawling over my body and the unwanted touches from them. And the spider web that's covering much of the page represents how what they did to me stuck to me, I hike all the time and I think about like when I walk through a spider web and it just sticks to me and it's really hard to get off. And that's what I feel like this, my trauma is like this yuck that I just can't get off no matter how much I shake. Even when the spider, the man is long gone, what they did to me is still left behind, like that spider web that's still stuck. But what's really profound that I've been thinking about is that you can always get the spider web off. You might always remember that you were caught in the web, but over time, it won't have its hold on you and eventually to let go. I didn't come to that until after a few days of processing, but this represents again my early life. And then the next board that I did represents like what I was going through, in my early teens, in particular, when my traumas were at their worst. And what you could see here is there's both a baby gorilla holding on and a frog that's holding on, and I have the words holding on. And and that's significant because I was really scared, and like this is the baby gorilla is very significant because it represents that like I was really a child when this was happening to me, and I was scared and felt that the world was a scary place, and I was just hanging on for dear life and not really sure, because I wasn't sure what to expect, because life had shown itself to be so scary and such a dangerous place that I wasn't sure what was lurking around the next corner. And but what's also significant about this picture that I chose, this one particular, is the frog being so colorful. And the reason I chose that is because even when I was a child, even when I was going through abuses that I never told about, I still showed a smile to the world. I still was bubbly and for most days cheerful and upbeat, and I'm still like that today. And so most people never knew what I was going through because I didn't show that to the world. And even today, most people who see me today would never know unless they've heard my story of what I experienced in my life, because I always greet the world with a smile. And what's interesting though is because I've always greeted the world with a smile, including when I was young and when my traumas were at their worst, it makes it so some people don't believe me. It's really interesting. People have this idea that if you've experienced all these terrible things, that there's no way you can go on smiling. And I'll admit that part of why I kept on smiling is, well, programming from society. In general, women are encouraged not to bother people with their problems and to keep it to themselves. So that was part of it, and part of it is just I wanted to hold on. I mean, back to me holding on. I wanted to hold on to a belief that maybe the world wasn't terrible, like all of it wasn't terrible. And so I think there's a real few reasons why I've continued to be happy and bubbly. And I'm glad I have, because now that I'm very much on the other side of my deepest and darkest days, um, I I believe that overall life is beautiful and there's lots to embrace. And so I'm glad that I never let go of my bubbly nature. Now, this is actually two parts of that day. So I don't know if you can see this here. So our first project of the day was actually to do to put a face or an image to our inner critic. And I think I'm going to start doing this more often with my own groups because this was really powerful. And it's pretty vicious. You could see there's this wolf with like its teeth showing, it's got a little blood in there, the walrus with a bloody face, you got wolves ripping apart an animal, like pretty brutal stuff. And what people don't realize is this is my inner critic. I knew that I needed teeth and blood to be showing in my inner critic because that's literally, I feel like what's happening to me when my inner critic is at work is that I'm literally being like ripped apart and it's like breaking me down and destroying me bit by bit. And, it's really interesting is that even today, people don't realize that one of my insecurities is my level of intelligence. Like, there's part of me that doesn't believe that I'm that smart. And I tell that to some people and they're like, what? What? Like, because I have a PhD. I taught over 25 different courses, most of them sciences on the college level. And they're like, you think you're not smart, but they don't realize this is like an early belief system that was ingrained into me as a child. And so it's hard to let go of, even though I released it a little bit, it's still there. And so people don't realize that there's part of me where I just feel like when that inner critic is doing its work, even today, that it's tearing me apart. Like, luckily, I'm able to pick up the pieces a little quicker when it's doing its work. But it's still at work sometimes. And that's why I was trying to think of a really ferocious name. So based on the conversations I have with my group, we came up with Diablo. And I felt like it was a perfect representation of my inner critic. And I think it's important to put a name to our inner critic. So when it's at work, we can be like, okay, I see you, Diablo. Yes, you're at work, but not, I don't need you. Like, no, I'm going to put you away, and coming up with a way to put our inner critic aside. Now, part of my inner critic, I don't know if you can see here, is also this big gorilla, and it's like looking down, almost like a condemning, judgmental look. And that's part of what happens with my inner critic. I am can be very harsh and judgmental of myself. And that's a reflection of this inner voice from this inner critic that is condemning my every move and judging everything I say or do. And again, even though I've done a lot of great work and my inner critic is not as loud as it used to be, it still comes rearing its ugly head every now and then. And I think what's significant is that this inner critic developed early in life. And the more traumas that I experienced, the more ferocious my inner critic became. And that's why the next part of my storyboard became how I guess, adjusted and accounted for that very loud inner critic. And so this is showing a bird that's like puffing up and looking big and scary. And then this bird destroying, it's like a crab or lobster of some sort. I don't know if you can see like a leg falling off. And I have this to show like what I did to combat this ferocious inner critic that so in an effort to not be judged so harshly, I tried to become great at as many things I could. So this is like me inflating my ego. And so me pursuing big degrees and big titles and, big adventures that people would be impressed by. But this part represents, so this is more the inflated ego and me puffing myself up to feel big and important and that I was enough. And this part represents that how ferocious I became. And what's interesting is that I became very ferocious, in particular to people I loved, especially in significant relationships. So, like in intimate relationships. Many of the men, especially even in some of my more recent relationships, I can be extremely harsh. And I've done a better job at catching myself and being able to reflect on when that is coming up. But I know that that's been in many ways a defense. Like, I have felt that I've been torn down in so many ways. So I have like almost as like, in many ways a response to that, I have become vicious, and especially to men. And it's almost like I use the current men in my life as a way to take out all the aggression and pain that I felt towards all the men that hurt me early on. And I never got to say what I wanted to say. And so it's how one way that I survived. And I'm working on minimizing this ferocious part of me and the big ego part. But I also have to acknowledge that they served me in important ways. Like my life, I consider my ego a life raft in many ways. Like I spent most of my early life feeling like I wasn't enough and I wasn't significant. And so by pursuing big titles and big degrees and big adventures, it allowed me the acknowledgments that I had been feeling deprived of for so many years. And so it helped me to survive, but now I'm needing to cull it back. I can see nowadays, especially with my yoga practice, how my ego, how it used to serve me really well, but maybe now how I need to tone it down some. But I have to acknowledge that it served me really well. And the vicious part of me, like, that's the fighter in me. And after experiencing all that I have in life, I don't know if I could keep on going if that fighter wasn't in me and I had that desire to just keep going. And so even though I can still be vicious today and I know I need to tone it down, I also have to acknowledge that that fighter in me has served me really well. And I guess why I want to say that to you is that we often want to be hypercritical and judgmental of all the bad qualities that we have about us, especially if we're judgmental and harsh. But we have to realize that every habit, behavior that we acquired it for a reason, and it's because it served us at some point in time. Now, it may no longer be serving us as much as it did before, so we might have to start letting some of those past behaviors and habits go, but we have to acknowledge like what they did for us, so we don't feel so ashamed and disappointed in ourselves by the fact that we've kept them around for so long. So my final board of my story, so it's hard to see probably again with all the light, but I don't know if you can see the back board has like gold in it. And I'm a huge fan of kintsugi, which is the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery with a precious metal like gold, platinum, or silver. And I love kintsugi because I love this idea that we can be more beautiful after we're put back together than before. I spent so many years of my life feeling that I was broken and unlovable and unworthy of love because I was broken. And with studying kintsugi and the more that I heal, I realize actually I'm special because of all that I experienced. And in many ways, I have a lot of beauty in my life because of my broken parts, and I'm embracing those parts of me that I used to, wish that I didn't have. And now I've sealed them in gold and realized that they're beautiful parts of me now and not parts to be ashamed of. Now, the bald eagle in the middle is very significant because it signifies freedom. And, I have hard days still, of course. There's days I'm still depressed, and there's days I overeat, and there's days that I'm down on myself. But overall, I feel free. I feel free from the traumas of my past. And again, even they sink in some days into my present life, but overall I'm able to keep moving forward. And even though I may stumble a little bit some days, even still today, I'm still chugging right along, and I've broken free. So that's significant. And then the butterflies are, of course, a symbol of transformation. And we know my book is titled Transformation After Trauma because I truly believe that's what's possible after we experience immense adversity in life, is that it can expand our opportunities and our ways of thinking, and we can just live an even more beautiful life after we've endured so much. And so the flower that's blooming bright is my symbol of rebirth, and just being a bright and beautiful future full of opportunities and new life ahead. Because the biologist in me knows that every flower that blooms, why it's blooming, is so it can reproduce new offspring and new life. And so every new flower gives rise to new life. And so this is me. And I think this is the power of telling our story, is that this is where my story began, with the men crawling into bed with me when I was young, and the men that touched me and kissed me and groped me when they didn't have my permission to. This was the beginning of my story, but this isn't the end. I chose the ending, and I chose the ending to be this. And that is such a beautiful part of using creative expression to tell our story. And we don't have to, I mean, if you read my book, you know that I talk about a lot of different ways of healing. And one, I spent a whole chapter on creative expression, but we can tell our story in different ways. We can, tell it through journaling and dance. And sometimes it's not our whole story, it's just part of our story, maybe a bit of emotions that we're feeling at a moment in time or have felt and we want to get out. Your story always doesn't always have to be in a timeline, but I felt this was an important practice for me, and an important practice for me to see that my beginning and ends were very different. And so for any of you who have also experienced trauma, or just have gone or are going through a very difficult time in your life, just know that that moment, or in the past, or this moment now, doesn't have to define your future. And you can rewrite the ending. It's completely within your control. And I'm not going to pretend it's easy, but I will tell you it's possible. And so please let me know if you have any questions. Thanks so much for listening.